on that. Well, hello everybody. Great to be here. Hey, and thanks for being flexible coming in the morning. Obviously, we have our hearings that Leader Lawson is chairing this afternoon, and I did not want to interrupt that. A very incredibly important discussion on the Department of Mental Health. And I know he spoke with the commissioner yesterday ahead of time, and excited about full cooperation coming from the Department of Mental Health, as well as some other stakeholders and interested parties that are coming to testify at the hearing. And look, I think oftentimes in politics you see things come together where you have committees that start with an end goal in mind. In this situation, we are truly wanting to dig in. We don't know how this is going to end, and we're genuinely calling this investigation and these hearings so we can figure out what in the world is going on, how much money do we need to finish the fiscal year, how much money is needed next year, what's going on with the contracts, where are we on the consent decree that we entered in earlier this year, and let's dig in, let's get some answers, and obviously there's a lot of talk about the numbers, and that certainly matters, the budget matters, but we also have to talk about the people at the end of those numbers that are impacted by the decisions that have been going on. And so just very thrilled for Representative Lawson to be, that he was willing to take this on, as well as the other members of the committee, because it's going to be a lot of work. But we've got to get some answers before our constitutional deadline by the last Friday in May. So happy to take some questions.
I'll throw out what Saturday is the anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombing. And I know that you obviously were not old. I mean, you were probably less than a year old when that happened.
One. Mm-hmm.
And I kind of want to get your experiences growing up as a kid in Oklahoma, learning about that, and if you're afraid that, obviously there's a lot of charged political rhetoric going on at all levels of government. If you're worried or concerned that we may be headed toward another disaster like that.
So we had our remembrance ceremony here, and I appreciate the Senate coming over for a joint session. Representative Rick West has some dear friends that he lost in the bombing, and every year he reads their names on the House floor, and was very grateful for the Senate coming over and having a joint session this year, and having former Governor Keating share his perspective. And as you mentioned, I was 1 year old when the Oklahoma City bombing happened, and I mentioned that to say, a lot of people, you always remember where you were, right? Well, I was one. I don't. And so I think that the fact that Speaker of the House for Oklahoma was 1 year old at the time is a reminder of just the reason we need to remember and never forget what happened. And so I've had a lot of those conversations with the folks at the memorial. And last year when we talked about doing their, I can't remember exactly what they're calling it, but their tours of hope, where they're going around. And it was a really cool situation. About 7-8 months ago, they called me, the folks at the memorial, and said, hey, we would love to do an event in in Creek County somewhere, and what school should we reach out to? And I live in Bristow, do a lot of things in Bristow and DPU where I grew up, and so I said, well, how about Manford? I don't get to go there as much because I don't live there, just on a whim. And so I called the superintendent, Kelly Spradlin, and he immediately said, absolutely. Kyle Genzer, one of our principals, his mother passed away in the bombing, and I had no idea, obviously. And so you talk about the future and lessons learned. I can tell you from what I experienced in Manford a few months ago, where all those high school freshmen came in. 14-year-olds, sometimes it's hard to get their attention, but they all were locked in when Mr. Genzer got up and told his personal story and his connection, and how the events of the bombing led him to where he is today as a principal at Manford, and the impact that he's been able to have, and take that terrible incident and make something good out of it. And so anyway, I know that's kind of a long answer, but I think what they're doing to go around to all the schools in all 77 counties is important. Planting the survivor trees across the state is important, so people never forget.
Can I ask about the initiative petition bill? There was quite a bit of uproar in the committee earlier this week. I know there's been some confusion. Some people think it's cities when it's really counties. Can you just kind of clear up the point of that bill and why it's important?
Sure. So looking at I didn't bring the statistics with me in front of me, but looking at the statistics of previous state questions, the signature gathering process overwhelmingly happens in the metro areas. And so the point of that section of the bill, now there's various sections of the bill, but that particular section is the one that gets the most conversation, is to make sure the initiative petition process is something that happens throughout more counties in the state and isn't just confined to the metro areas, and making sure Oklahomans across the state have an opportunity to be involved in the process.
I
I think you were asked about this maybe last week, the bill in the House committee that failed that would have provided car tag information for, I think, all tribal governments. I didn't realize at the time that I believe most of the tribes in Eastern Oklahoma reservations have compacts now with the state that include that information. I guess the Muskogee Nation does not, and that was maybe specifically tailored to address that tribe's situation. I believe your district
Sure.
expands into the Muskogee Nation. What is your understanding? What have you heard from the tribe?
Yeah.
How
So
did that vote come about?
So I would say a lot of the larger tribes, I wouldn't say most of the tribes, but the larger
Yes,
tribes in particular have compacts with the state on this issue. The Muskogee Creek Nation currently does not. I've had conversations with the Muskogee Creek Nation about what could we do collaboratively to solve this issue. As I mentioned in my last, I think it was last week in press availability, I do believe every Oklahoman should contribute when they pay the tolls. So I agree with the governor on that particular subject, but I would say there's ways to go about it differently. And so what I would like to see happen is a collaborative agreement with the Muskogee Creek Nation. I think that's possible. Right now it appears this particular issue is being held, the tobacco compact is being held up over the toll road compact. So one side says we won't talk about it until this issue is handled, and the other side says we won't talk about it until this issue is handled, and so it's kind of turned into a stalemate. But the tobacco compact is something that we do need to operate with a tobacco compact, and that expired March 31st with the Muskogee Creek Nation. And so both of those issues need to be addressed and need to be addressed collaboratively.
Which side, do you know which side is saying which one needs to be dealt with first?
Sure. Well, my perspective on it, it appears the Muskogee Creek Nation doesn't want the issues tied together and believes we should address the tobacco compact, which is now expired. Whereas it appears the other side of the negotiation doesn't want to talk about the tobacco compact until we address the turnpike issue. But they are really two separate issues, and so the tobacco compacts, and we've gotten into this before in this building, they're important. Obviously, the tribal nations want those, but those are also important for the private sector, non-tribal smoke shops, that we have those compacts in place, because otherwise you have an unfair playing field where if somebody is a tribal citizen and they go into a tribal smoke shop, they're not paying the tax if there's no compact in place. And then if they go across the street to Quick Trip, OnQ, Love's, whatever, then they are paying the tax. And so it creates an unfair advantage one way over the other. And so we need to address both of those issues, but do so in a way working collaboratively with the tribes. And I'm hopeful that we can get there.
Is the House, and I'm sorry, last question on this. What level of priority is this for you? I mean, is it something where you can see the House interjecting or calling a State Tribal Relations Committee meeting to talk about it? Like, how are you going to be concerned if there's not a resolution by the end of May when you guys leave?
I mean, it's certainly concerning if there's not a resolution, but the ideal scenario is the executive branch negotiating those compacts, because you have one person negotiating the compact with the other leader of a sovereign tribal nation. And so, but certainly that is an option the legislature has exercised in the past, where the legislature takes up compact extensions. But right at this moment, that's not something that we're talking about, but it is something that the legislature's done before and could potentially do.
I got a question. So school standards are, I don't know if y'all have discussed it or not, but there's a deadline coming up where they automatically go in if action isn't taken at all on it. And the biggest thing people have been concerned about is the social studies standards. The new board members haven't had a say. One of them voted no last board meeting 2 months ago against them because things were added to them, like counting 2020 election theories, other things. Have y'all discussed these standards at all, like the social studies standards? Are y'all acting on it? Is there any conversation at all?
Well, we have discussed them, and there are continuing to be conversations. We still have some time if we were to do something. But look, as I've said before, there's a lot in the standards. There's a lot that's not in the standards that's said to be in the standards. And in fact, I mean, just this morning, I was reading an article that said, and I'll read it verbatim, if lawmakers do nothing, it would mean thousands of Oklahoma students would be required to be taught about claims that the 2020 presidential election was stolen. I've looked through the standards. I don't see anywhere in the standards that says that it requires teachers to teach that. So I think there's a lot that's that's not in the standards that is portrayed as being in the standards that allows teachers to teach this important issue. And so anyway, we're going to continue to dig into it, but our final decision on which direction we go has not been determined yet.
This is not my outlet, but that same story was talking about a school board member wanting the legislature to send it back. Have you heard about those board members wanting it?
I read that article this morning, so that's the first I've heard about it. None of them have called me.
Okay. Well, then on to my real question here. I just want to ask, because you did bring up that story, was about mental health and everything. The governor said yesterday, I want to assure Oklahomans that we are providing the same dollars. We're not cutting any kind of services. You, just a little bit ago, were saying, you know, obviously the number is important, but the people impacted by that number is more important. So, you know, what do you think of that remark from the governor? Do you think, you know, obviously we've talked about contracts and more, so do you have any worry about services?
Well, that's part of the reason we're digging in and having an investigation to find out what the actual impact of this is going to be at the end of the day, because that certainly matters. And you know, I agree with what the governor said. Our top level number of we haven't cut the mental health funding. I agree with that. One of the challenges is you know, as cost of things go up, things do get more expensive. But also we've seen a greater strain on our mental health system versus what it was, you know, a decade ago. And so what does that look like? Also structurally of funding it, what does that look like? You know, I've advocated previously that I think we should send all Medicaid funding through the Oklahoma Healthcare Authority instead of some of it going to OHCA, some of it going to DHS, and some of it going to the Department of Mental Health. But you know, ultimately what we decide to do there, that's a lot of what they'll discuss this afternoon in this investigation.
Do you anticipate trying to push a bill, bring something forward, get an agreement with Paxton on running everything through HCA?
Him and I have not talked about that specifically yet. I mean, I've brought it up, but I think it'll be more appropriate after we have a hearing or two to see, because I think all these things kind of tie together.
Could be something of a JCAB.
Certainly.
Mr. Speaker, you've talked a little bit about mental health from the beginning, and I was just wondering, what are you expecting to get from, or you want to get from, the House committee hearing today with Friesen?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, that we're truly having this committee to get answers to questions that we don't currently have and get some assurances. So we're not starting an investigation with an end in mind, other than we want to know what happened, what needs to happen, how we can continue to provide services that we need for Oklahomans. And again, as I've mentioned before, if the governor has stated that there are some bad contracts, if there are some bad contracts, by all means, let's renegotiate bad contracts, but do so in a prospective manner, not in a retrospective manner that could potentially set us up into a problematic position in terms of lawsuits. But also making sure we're in a good position with the consent decree, as well as there's been a lot of conversations about inpatient beds and what are we going to do at Donahue? What are we going to do to finish out Tulsa? What are we going to do at Griffin? We need to talk about a lot of these issues, and that's again why I appointed Leader Mark Lawson to this task, because he's somebody certainly with the policy and political chops to handle these very difficult questions that straddle both fiscal matters as well as policy matters.
Right. There's been, in addition to today's committee meeting, there's been a request from the state auditor to look into this issue, a special investigator, and then also Loft is looking into this. Can you talk about the need for 4 different, you know, investigations and how they're going to work together potentially?
Absolutely. So in terms of the auditor and Loft and the House, we're all communicating. So the work that we're doing, it has been collaborative, and we're going to continue to work together on this. And I know our staff and our legislators have been in communication with Loft as well as the state auditor. So while they have 3 separate processes, those are really a cohesive unit to try to dig into this. You know, as far as the other investigation that was announced earlier this week, I don't know what the plans are with that one, but as for the other 3, we're working collaboratively together on this.
Changing gears a little bit, Mr. Speaker. On JNC yesterday, the governor during his press conference talked about how he'd prefer to see a more federalized structure for the judicial selection in Oklahoma, where he gets the sole appointment and the Senate confirms or denies that appointment. If I remember looking at the bill correctly, I think that bill's dead or defunct for now anyway. But there is still the House resolution that is pending. Just your thoughts on the way forward there. Is it something that you're interested in catering to the governor?
So as you'll probably recall, the only joint resolution we sent over to the Senate was related to this topic of reforming the Judicial Nominating Commission. Last year, there was SJR 34 that came over to the House, and that failed on the House floor to totally repeal the JNC. But members of the House, that failing of SJR 34 was not saying that everything at the Judicial Nominating Commission is good. That was just saying we didn't want to repeal the whole thing. And so what we've been working on collaboratively with the Senate is what can we do to make necessary reforms. And I would also point out that in this past week, we got Justice Travis Jett, and the governor and I both praised that selection. And so I would say it's difficult to say that the current process is totally flawed when the current process got us someone who's going to be a really good justice on the bench.
I will say, just in fairness to the governor, that he didn't say that he had any particular problem with the JNC besides the way that the vetting was done of the candidates for justices that he might get to a point.
Sure.
I guess obviously if he had more control, it would be better off for him. But he said that it's worked out well for him so far. He's made 4 appointments, and they've all kind of agree with his position on the law. I just wondered what your comments are.
And so I would say, and I didn't listen to the press conference, so based on what you're telling me, I would say that just affirms the position that some reforms and tweaks probably make more sense than an outright repeal. And so there are some things that we should do. I think for one thing, the pro tem of the Senate, the Speaker of the House, and current law are prohibited from appointing attorneys. And we're also prohibited from appointing someone to serve more than a 6-year term consecutively. And so you appoint a layperson, takes them several years to get up to speed on how the process works. And as soon as they get up to speed, as a layperson, they can't be reappointed. And so those 2 simple changes of being able to appoint an attorney and also being able to appoint someone to 2 consecutive terms, I think are some good reforms that could tweak the process that could make it better.
I ask you a little bit about, yesterday was OSU Day at the Capitol. I'm sure you got a photo with Pistol Pete. $295 million request is still pending. It's a one-time capital for the vet school. We've talked about that before. I'm curious, you had mentioned that TSET had come forward and said they might be willing to help fund some things. The director then said, well, we're talking about a grant program that you would have to apply for, and decisions wouldn't be made till late June. What other conversations have you had with TSET? Because that doesn't sound like you would have any surety that they could get $80 million
Sure.
or $60 million or
So when you said problems with OSU Day, I thought you were going to reference the Pistol Pete falling down on the south side, which Caroline had to tweet out. But
guns are heavy.
yeah, it was. I still think it was sabotage. The wind was blowing the opposite direction.
Some things are meant to be, guys.
Yeah, uh-huh. So on TSET, we're having conversations with I had a meeting with the director, and I know we're having conversations with their board members as well about what a potential collaborative relationship could look like. They have some funds and built-up interest that they're wanting to invest around the state. I think it would totally make sense to partner with the legislature on some of those investments and work collaboratively. Their money can go farther partnered with us, and taxpayer money we appropriate could go farther partnered with TSET. And so I'm hopeful. We'll see what ultimately happens now, and what potential projects would make sense for their funds.
Where does this stand in budget negotiations? I mean, do you have pretty strong support from your caucus that that school needs to be a priority, or is there still some thought that, hey, this is a tight budget year and we may not have the money to dump $300 million into that?
Well, if you want to see the House position, go to okhouse.gov on the transparency portal, and everything that's on there, that's where we're at.
Thank you.
Speaker, there's a Senate Bill 995 on changing up the way that the administrative rules for state agencies are approved by the legislature. The way that I understand it makes a pretty simple tweak, which is that if the legislature does nothing, then it's an automatic rejection. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on the need for that, given some of the context with the State Board of Education and the way that's all unfolding.
So the legislatures went back and forth on that particular concept several times over the past couple of decades. I think the important thing that we could do is pass the REINS Act, which was one of the first pieces of legislation that we passed, which would provide more oversight on administrative rules process when there's a fiscal impact on the bill. And I know Chairman Kendricks has been in good conversations with Chairman Bergstrom over on the Senate side to try to see what we can do to get that across the finish line.
One question, Christ is King situation just happened today with the resolution. Many people have argued that it's a complication of separation of church and state, that it complicates the matter. What is your thoughts on that when it comes to
I debated it.
resolution?
I debated in favor of the measure. I didn't think we would be debating against Christianity during Holy Week, but that's where it was. But look, I support the resolution, and you saw overwhelming support in the House floor today.
Last question. Or are we done?
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.